In a world where empires rose on glory and buried their sins in silence, this channel opens the doors history tried to erase. Here, we don't tell the stories you learned in school. We uncover the rituals, the betrayals, the forbidden truths carved into palace walls. Every video is a descent into power, fear, and the dark secrets of kings, queens, and forgotten victims. So if you're ready to witness the side of history they tried to erase, subscribe to this channel so we can stay connected. Be sure to like the video and step into the shadows with us, where the real past still breathes. In the year 778, high in the frozen passes of the Pyrenees, an army died screaming in the dark. History tells us it was a heroic last stand, a loyal knight, a noble sacrifice. A legend named Roland, who blew his horn too late and became immortal. But legends are built to hide things, because buried inside the most famous poem of medieval Europe, one word keeps repeating like a warning no one understood: nephew. Roland was always called Charlemagne's nephew, never once his son. For 12 centuries, no one questioned it until scholars began uncovering older manuscripts, forgotten oral traditions, and coded language medieval poets used to hide forbidden truths. What they found points to a secret so disturbing. It was erased from royal records, buried by the church, and sealed inside epic verse. A relationship between an emperor and his own sister, a child born in silence, a hero raised as a lie. Tonight, we open the palace doors history tried to keep closed, and step into the private court of the man they call the Father of Europe. The horn that sounded like a confession. France. Year 778 AD. The Pyrenees Mountains rise like a wall between worlds cold, jagged, and ancient enough to remember wars long before Charlemagne's banners ever touched their wind. The pass of Roncesvalles is narrow, a throat of stone where armies move in single file, vulnerable, exposed. On this day, the mountain is not silent. It is alive with the sound of dying men. From the ridges above, Basque fighters descend without warning, ghosts of the terrain, men who know every shadow, every loose rock, every echo. They strike the rear guard of Charlemagne's army with surgical precision. Wagons burn, horses scream. Steel collides in frantic bursts that vanish as quickly as they erupt. The Frankish rear guard is cut off, trapped between cliff walls and an enemy that melts back into the fog after every kill. At the center of the slaughter stands a knight whose name will outlive empires. Roland, commander of the rear guard, the most celebrated warrior in the Frankish world. Young, fearless, and proud to the point of legend. At his side hangs the sword Durandal, said to contain holy relics within its hilt. Across his shoulder rests an ivory horn oliphant, the instrument meant to summon Charlemagne if the line ever breaks. But Roland does not blow it, not at first. Because Roland believes heroes do not call for help. Heroes win or they die. The battle tightens. Men fall around him in circles of blood and dust. The Basques strike again and again, faster, closer, more merciless each time. Roland's companions beg him to sound the horn, to call the emperor, to bring the full might of the Frankish army crashing back through the pass. He refuses. Pride becomes fatal. Steel becomes scarce. The rear guard collapses piece by piece until Roland stands amid bodies, friends, knights, banners trampled into mud. Only when the end is unavoidable does he lift the horn. When he blows it, the sound tears through the mountains like a wounded animal. It echoes ridge to ridge, carrying for miles across ice and stone. Far ahead, Charlemagne hears it. The emperor stops his army. He knows that sound. He knows what it means. But the distance is too great. By the time Charlemagne turns back, Roland is already dying. The knight falls facing the enemy, placing his sword beneath him so no one can claim it. A warrior's death. A martyr's posture. A legend sealed in blood. This is the story told in the Song of Roland, the most celebrated epic poem of medieval Europe. For centuries, it defined heroism itself. Knights carried Roland's example into crusades. Kings invoked his loyalty as scripture. His name became immortal. But inside that poem, inside its rhythm and reverence, one word repeats with strange insistence: nephew. Roland is introduced as Charlemagne's nephew. He dies as Charlemagne's nephew. He is mourned as the emperor's nephew. The poem repeats the word with unusual frequency, as though reminding the audience of a relationship no one questioned. For 1,000 years, no one did. Uncle and sister's son. Simple, noble, clean. Until scholars began examining the older traditions behind the poem, the oral histories, the Italian chronicles, the fragmented chansons that existed before the written epic took shape. What they found did not align with the word the poem preserved. Because in medieval literary convention, certain kinship terms carried coded meanings, words that concealed truths too dangerous to write openly. And among those codes, one appeared again and again in cases of forbidden lineage: nephew, not always meaning a sister's son. Sometimes meaning a son whose true parentage could not be acknowledged, because acknowledging it would expose a sin powerful enough to shatter crowns. The deeper scholars dug, the more the pattern repeated. Multiple traditions, multiple regions. Same implication buried beneath the same word. Roland may not have been Charlemagne's nephew at all. He may have been his son. A son born not from a queen, not from a concubine, but from the emperor's own sister, her name appearing in records only as a shadow. Gisela. If true, the greatest hero of medieval Europe was born from an act the Church classified among the gravest sins imaginable. A transgression so severe it required years of penance and absolute silence, which would explain the poem's code. The repetition, the concealment, the locked door hidden inside a single word, because legends can be rewritten. Churches can edit memory. Empires can bury scandal beneath stone and scripture, but sometimes the truth survives anyway, hidden in poetry, waiting for someone to read it not as myth, but as evidence. And if Roland's bloodline was hidden, then the question becomes darker. What else inside Charlemagne's private court had to be erased to protect the man history calls the father of Europe? The sister who was not allowed to exist in the official records of the Carolingian court, she barely exists. Her name appears inconsistently: Gisela, sometimes rendered differently depending on the chronicler, but always briefly, always without depth. In a court that documented gifts to ambassadors, the weight of bread in markets, the movements of armies across provinces, the emperor's own sister occupies only fragments of ink. No extended description, no political marriage, no dramatic event, just a presence and then absence. That silence is not accidental. Charlemagne's palace at Aachen was not merely a residence. It was the most powerful court in Western Europe, engineered to project permanence and divine authority. Marble halls echoed with Latin debates. Gold mosaics reflected torchlight. Foreign envoys from Baghdad and Constantinople stood beneath octagonal arches, while scholars praised the emperor as a new Constantine. Nothing inside that palace was undocumented by chance. Yet Gisela's life leaves almost no official trace. In the Frankish world, royal daughters and sisters were instruments of alliance. Marriage was diplomacy. Blood was currency. A sister of the emperor would have been a valuable political asset, married to secure loyalty, strengthen borders, bind rival houses. That was how power functioned. That was how empires survived. But Gisela was never married. She did not leave court to establish her own household. She did not become the wife of a king or duke whose loyalty Charlemagne needed. She remained inside the palace complex, close to her brother's authority, visible yet politically neutralized. That is the first anomaly. The second emerges not from official chronicles, but from literary traditions, operating outside ecclesiastical control. Italian and Franco-Italian texts, older than the surviving French epic, preserve whispers of a relationship that should never have existed. A bond between Charlemagne and his sister, described in language that suggests more than affection and more than politics. These traditions are independent of one another, composed in different regions, across generations. Yet the pattern persists. Charlemagne, his sister, a forbidden closeness, a child. When institutions erase, poets remember. The Church had reason to manage Charlemagne's image. He was crowned emperor by the Pope in 800 AD. His legitimacy strengthened Rome's authority. His campaigns enforced conversion at sword point. He was the Church's champion in a violent world. A scandal of incest within his household would not merely stain his name, it would fracture the spiritual authority the Church had invested in him. And so, the official record remains clean. No accusation, no trial, no confession, only silence. But silence behaves differently when it surrounds power. It feels less like absence and more like containment. Gisela's vanishing from the archives mirrors the vanishing of uncomfortable details in other royal histories. Documents lost, mentions abbreviated, roles reduced. It is a pattern of management. Meanwhile, the Song of Roland insists on one word nephew. Over and over, a term safe on its surface. A term socially acceptable. But in medieval literary convention, nephew sometimes served as a coded substitute for a son born under circumstances that could not be acknowledged publicly. If Roland was truly the son of Gisela, and if Charlemagne was that child's father, then Emperor's sister could never be allowed a narrative of her own. Her story would threaten the architecture of sainthood and empire built around her brother's name. So she fades, not because she was insignificant, but because she was dangerous. And the more one studies the palace at Aachen, the proximity of private chambers, the sealed nature of court life, the absolute authority Charlemagne exercised within those walls, the more the question sharpens into something colder. If Gisela did bear a child within that palace, who had the power to refuse the emperor? Einhard's poisoned paragraph. If the palace at Aachen was the heart of Charlemagne's empire, then Einhard was the man who watched it beat from the inside. He was not a distant historian writing generations later. He lived at court, walked its corridors, attended its feasts, observed the emperor not as legend but as routine. When Einhard wrote Vita Caroli, Magni the Life of Charlemagne, he produced what remains the most important biography of any medieval ruler, which makes one passage in his account feel less like history and more like controlled detonation. Einhard admired Charlemagne. That much is clear. His biography praises the emperor's intellect, his conquests, his devotion to Christianity, his patronage of learning. The tone is loyal, almost protective. But loyalty, when forced to coexist with truth, produces tension in the text. And nowhere is that tension sharper than in the section concerning Charlemagne's daughters. The emperor had several: Rotrude, Bertha, Isala, Theodrata, Hiltrud, raised within the palace, educated beyond the norm for women of their era, present at court ceremonies and diplomatic receptions. By all appearances, they were privileged royal daughters at the center of imperial power. Yet Einhard records a decision so unusual, it disrupts the entire structure of Frankish politics. Charlemagne refused to let any of them marry. Not one. In a world where royal daughters were essential diplomatic instruments, this refusal was unprecedented. Marriage alliances forged loyalty, secured borders, prevented rebellion. Charlemagne used every diplomatic tool available to him with strategic precision, except this one. Einhard offers an explanation, written in a sentence so polished it has echoed through 12 centuries of scholarship. He loved his daughters so deeply that he could not bear to be separated from them. Read alone, it sounds tender. A father's affection elevated above politics. Read within context, it sounds different. It sounds like possession reframed as devotion. because what follows in Einhard's account fractures the innocence of that explanation. He writes that the arrangement produced scandalous scandals. He does not specify them. He does not elaborate. He does not accuse. He places the word carefully, like a sealed document left in plain sight, and moves on. Then he adds the final detail. The daughters bore children, illegitimate children, born within the palace, raised at court. Acknowledged but unexplained, Einhard offers no fathers, no marriages, no clarifications. Only sequence, refusal to let daughters marry, scandals, illegitimate children, and silence. For historians, the structure of this passage is impossible to ignore. Einhard was not careless. He modeled his biography on classical Roman works, known for implication rather than accusation. He understood narrative architecture. He knew exactly what placing these facts together would suggest without forcing him to say it. It reads like testimony written under political restraint. The daughters could not leave court. They lived under constant supervision. The palace was a closed system, movements observed, interactions visible. Anonymous encounters were nearly impossible. Later sources attempt to name courtiers as fathers, minor nobles, poets, advisors. Men of low enough rank to pose no political threat. Men entirely dependent on Charlemagne's favor for survival. But that explanation introduces its own unease. If courtiers fathered these children, they did so inside the emperor's household, under his knowledge, and survived. Which means the relationships were permitted, managed, controlled. Einhard never writes the conclusion. He does not accuse the emperor he served. He does not name the nature of the scandals. He records only the evidence arranged with surgical care and leaves the reader to confront the implications alone. It is the most dangerous form of historical writing. Not accusation, but preservation. Because once the sequence is seen, it cannot be unseen. And if the emperor controlled not only his daughter's freedom, but their intimacy, their motherhood, their very bodies, then the question darkens further. What began with one sister may have extended to all of them. The court of controlled sin's power on Charlemagne's scale did not exist in isolation. It required validation, ritual, divine endorsement. The sword could conquer territory, but only the church could sanctify a crown. And when Pope Leo III placed the imperial diadem on Charlemagne's head in Rome in the year 800, it was not merely a coronation. It was a transaction. The emperor became the protector of Christendom. The church became the guardian of his legitimacy. What bound them was not just faith but mutual dependence. Because empires generate sins proportional to their power. And medieval Christianity possessed an institutional system designed to manage exactly that. Penitential law, detailed manuals cataloged transgressions with legal precision. Theft, adultery, murder, each prescribed its penance. Fasting, pilgrimage, public confession. Years of spiritual restitution scaled to the severity of the offense. Among these entries existed one of the gravest categories imaginable: incest. Not vague moral condemnation, but explicit classification. Prescribed penances lasting years, sometimes decades, exclusion from communion, permanent spiritual stigma. The church did not treat the sin lightly. It regulated it with bureaucratic detail, which raises a question historians have wrestled with for centuries. If rumors surrounding Charlemagne's household reached ecclesiastical ears, how would the church respond? Public accusation would destabilize the empire that defended papal authority. Silence, however, required compensation. And Charlemagne's relationship with the church was defined by a generosity so vast it bordered on obsession. He donated land on a continental scale, transforming the church into one of Europe's largest landholders. He funded monasteries relentlessly, commissioned cathedrals, sponsored missionary campaigns, endowed religious institutions with wealth accumulated through conquest. Political alliance explains part of this. Piety explains another. But neither fully accounts for the urgency, the magnitude, the continuity of his giving. A third interpretation emerges in modern historiography, one less comfortable, but structurally coherent. Penance, not spoken aloud, not documented as confession, but enacted materially. Churches as offerings, monasteries as spiritual payments, land grants as absolution rendered in stone rather than words. Because penitential systems were designed precisely for rulers whose sins could not be publicly prosecuted. Quiet atonement preserved political stability while satisfying ecclesiastical doctrine. Silence in exchange for restitution. Absolution in exchange for obedience. If Charlemagne required such management, the church had motive to ensure the scandal never entered official record. The emperor's sanctity underpinned Western Christendom's political architecture. Exposing moral transgression within his bloodline risked undermining papal authority itself. And so, two institutions sustained each other. Charlemagne built churches. The church built silence. Within Aachen's palace, this arrangement translated into lived reality. Rituals of devotion unfolded alongside private behaviors shielded from scrutiny. Priests blessed imperial decisions. Bishops recorded victories. Monasteries rose across conquered lands, like spiritual fortresses reinforcing the emperor's image as Christianity's chosen sword. Yet penitential logic suggests that beneath public sanctity lay private negotiation. A ruler beyond earthly accountability required only one counterweight spiritual arbitration conducted discreetly, away from courts and chronicles. The system worked because exposure benefited no one. The church retained power. The emperor retained sainthood. History retained its hero. But suppressed truths have a way of leaving residues in literature, in coded language, in biographical silences that feel heavier than spoken accusation. Which brings the focus back to Roland. If the church could contain scandal within imperial chambers, it could also reshape how imperial bloodlines were remembered, transforming sons into nephews, transforming sins into metaphors, transforming biography into sanctified legend. And if penitents purchased silence in life, what arrangements were made after death? Because Charlemagne's burial did not follow Christian custom. It followed something stranger. The hero who could never be claimed legends are not born innocent. They are constructed layer by layer until memory hardens into myth and myth hardens into belief. Roland's story became the foundation of European chivalry. His name was invoked in crusades, whispered in courts, carved into the imagination of knights who believed courage meant standing alone against impossible odds. But the deeper one studies the Song of Roland, the more the emotional architecture begins to shift. Because the grief does not behave correctly. When Roland dies in the Pass of Roncesvalles, the poem lingers not on strategy, not on politics, but on Charlemagne's reaction. The emperor does not mourn like a distant sovereign losing a loyal commander. He collapses. He tears his beard. He faints upon Roland's body. He cries out as if something inside him has been torn loose. In medieval literature, grief has conventions. There are formal expressions, ritualized lament, controlled sorrow. Charlemagne's grief breaks form. It overwhelms the narrative. The word the poem insists upon is nephew. Roland is the emperor's sister's son. The relationship is clean, socially acceptable, structurally simple. But the grief reads like something else. It reads like a father mourning a son he could never publicly claim. This is not modern projection. Medieval audiences understood coded language. Kinship terms in epic poetry often carried layered meanings. Nephew could conceal a lineage too scandalous for formal acknowledgement. The code functioned as protection for poets, for patrons, for institutions invested in stability. And Roland's parentage sits at the center of that code. If the earlier traditions are correct, if Charlemagne fathered a child with his own sister, then Roland was born into secrecy from his first breath, raised at court, positioned as nephew, protected through ambiguity. The arrangement would have solved multiple political dilemmas at once. The child remains within the dynasty, but without destabilizing official succession. The emperor avoids public scandal while retaining control. The church maintains legitimacy by not forcing confrontation. Fear of exposure breeds careful language. Greed for power demands containment. Insecurity within bloodlines produces myth. And surprise lingers centuries later when scholars uncover patterns too consistent to dismiss. Roland's heroic death becomes even more strategic in this light. A son who dies gloriously cannot threaten inheritance. A martyr cannot challenge succession. A legend cannot accuse his father. Instead, he sanctifies him. The poem transforms tragedy into moral theater. Roland refuses to blow the horn out of pride. His delay becomes virtue twisted into fatality. His death reinforces the emperor's righteousness. The empire avenges him. Justice is restored. The narrative closes cleanly. But beneath that closure lies something unresolved. Why repeat nephew so obsessively? Why emphasize the relationship in a way that feels defensive? Why does Charlemagne's grief eclipse the battlefield itself? Because sometimes literature preserves emotional truth where historical documents cannot. A son hidden beneath a title. A bloodline disguised as diplomacy. A secret encoded in epic verse and recited across Europe for centuries by audiences who may have sensed more than they consciously understood. Roland's name survived because it was useful. It embodied courage. It embodied loyalty. And perhaps, without stating it openly, it embodied the cost of a secret that could never be spoken. If he was merely a nephew, the story remains heroic. If he was a son born of forbidden's blood, the story becomes something darker, an empire built not just on conquest, but on controlled silence. And if Roland's legend concealed one truth, what does Charlemagne's own death conceal? Because when the emperor finally left the world he ruled, he did not lie down like other men. He was seated. The emperor who refused to lie down, Charlemagne, died on January 28, 814 AD, 71 years old. 46 years on the throne, conqueror of Saxons, builder of an empire stretching from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, crowned by the Pope, an emperor history would name Father of Europe. The official account of his burial is simple. He was interred in the chapel at Aachen, the heart of his imperial capital, beneath vaulted stone and sacred light. A ceremony befitting a ruler sanctified by church and legend alike. But official accounts often function as architecture. They show what must be seen. They conceal what must remain buried. Because alongside the formal record, another tradition emerged persistent, repeated, and too detailed to dismiss as mere folklore. Charlemagne was not buried lying down. He was seated. According to multiple medieval sources, the emperor's body was placed upright on a marble throne in a sealed vault beneath the chapel. Crown on his head, scepter in his hand. Imperial robes draped over a body already surrendering to decay. An open gospel resting on his lap as though he were still holding court beneath the earth. It was not a Christian posture of rest. It was a posture of rule. The symbolism is unsettling. Death did not strip him of authority, it preserved it. The throne transformed burial into continuation, as if the empire feared what might happen if its architect were ever laid fully to rest. Spices and aromatics slowed decomposition, but did not prevent it. Flesh receded, skin tightened. Time worked patiently in darkness, while the emperor remained seated, crowned, enthroned in silence. And there he remained, for nearly 2 centuries. Above ground, Europe changed. The Carolingian dynasty fractured. Successors fought over fragments of inheritance. Borders shifted. Alliances dissolved. The empire Charlemagne built eroded piece by piece. But beneath Aachen, he still sat. Then, in the year 1000 AD, Emperor Otto III ordered the vault opened. Otto modeled his reign on Charlemagne's image. He saw himself as the restorer of imperial Rome. Opening the tomb was not curiosity. It was pilgrimage to the source of his own legitimacy. Chroniclers describe what he found with language bordering on disbelief. Charlemagne remained seated on the throne. The crown still rested on his skull. The robes, though deteriorated, clung to bone. The gospel lay open across his lap. Fingernails lengthened by the recession of fleshy, pierced through the gloves covering his hands. The emperor had become a relic of power rather than a body. Otto knelt before him. Not before a tomb, but before a seated sovereign long dead. He touched the remains, adjusted the robes, trimmed the nails, repaired fragments of the face. Some accounts claim he removed relics, a tooth, perhaps other fragments, carrying pieces of Charlemagne away as sacred tokens. This was not burial reverence. It resembled ritual contact belief that authority lingered physically within the corpse. The vault was sealed again. Charlemagne returned to darkness, still enthroned, still crowned, still symbolically ruling beneath the chapel floor for another century and a half. Only in 1165 did Frederick Barbarossa order the remains transferred to a sarcophagus, granting Charlemagne the conventional burial denied to him for over 300 years. By then, the legend was irreversible. Assemble the fragments now. A sister erased from record. A son hidden behind the word nephew. Daughters kept captive within palace walls. Scandals recorded but never explained. Churches rising like pennants across an empire. And an emperor seated after death as though authority itself refused to release him. History remembers Charlemagne as conqueror, reformer, saint. But shadows persist around monuments too carefully lit. Because power does not merely shape nations, it shapes memory. And sometimes the truth survives, not in chronicles, but in poems, silences, and sealed vaults beneath cathedrals where emperors sit long after the world above them has moved on. The father of Europe remains enthroned in history, but the darkness beneath the throne still keeps its secrets.